cracks in the foundation. The alliance Andrew and Maya had built was strong enough to weather whispers and overdue bills, but every foundation, no matter how solid, carried cracks invisible to the eye. And cracks, when pressed, widened. For Andrew, the pressure came in the form of mounting notices stuffed into his mailbox. Past due rent, utilities threatening shutoff, reminders that survival was a race he was losing. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, as though the paper itself carried bricks of failure. For Maya, the pressure wore a different face. Her employers, the Lennox family, had begun to notice her absences and her energy diverted toward distractions. One evening, Mrs. Lennox cornered her in the kitchen, voice dripping with condescension. "We can't afford to have staff whose loyalties are split, Maya. If this continues, we'll find someone more reliable." The threat was clear, and though Maya bit her tongue, she left the mansion that night with her heart clenched. When she arrived at Andrew's apartment, carrying a bag of rice and vegetables she had stretched her paycheck to cover, she found him pacing the small living room, Ellie asleep in the corner. His hair was disheveled, his jaw tight, his movements restless. "They're raising the rent," he muttered, thrusting the notice toward her. "200 more starting next month. I can't keep this place. I can't—" His voice cracked, and he slammed the paper onto the table as though force alone could erase it. Maya steadied him with her eyes, her voice calm but firm. "Then we'll find another way. Falling apart won't keep a roof over her head. We'll figure this out." But even as she said the words, doubt coiled in her stomach. For the first time since stepping into Andrew's storm, she wasn't sure sheer determination would be enough to hold back the tide. Thomas strikes again. The following morning, the blow came harder than either of them expected. Andrew arrived at the warehouse only to be told his position had been terminated. The manager's words were rehearsed, his tone uncomfortable but final. "There have been concerns. We can't risk it, Andrew. No explanation, no room for defense." Just like that, the last sliver of stability vanished. He didn't need to ask who was behind it. The answer came hours later in the form of a phone call. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, smooth, smug, dripping with triumph. "Told you, Andy. You'll never crawl out of the pit. Everything you touch turns to ash, and I'll make sure it stays that way." The line clicked dead, leaving Andrew gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles whitened. By the time he returned home, his fury was a living thing, pacing his chest like a caged beast. Maya was there, folding laundry with Ellie at her side, but the moment she saw his face, she knew something had broken. "He's behind it, isn't he?" she asked quietly. Andrew nodded, his eyes dark with rage. "He won't stop. He'll take everything, and I'll have nothing left to give her." He pointed toward Ellie, who sat coloring at the table, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Maya reached for him, but he pulled away, his pride flaring. "You don't understand. This is my fight, my failure, and now he's making me drag you into it." Her jaw tightened. "I chose to stand here, Andrew. Don't twist that into a burden. If you push me away, you're giving him exactly what he wants." The tension between them thickened, two stubborn hearts colliding in the same storm, each unwilling to yield. The breaking argument that night, the argument erupted. It began with bills spread across the table and ended with words sharp enough to cut skin. Andrew accused her of pitying him, of playing savior to soothe her own wounds. Maya shot back that his pride was killing him, that refusing help was the same as choosing to fail. Their voices rose, raw and unfiltered, filling the small apartment until Ellie woke with tears in her eyes. Andrew's hands trembled as he raked them through his hair. "Maybe you should go, Maya. Maybe Thomas is right. Maybe I'll only drag you down." The words sliced through her like knives, not because of their cruelty, but because of their fear. She stood frozen for a long moment, then gathered her coat with quiet dignity. "You're not dragging me down, Andrew. You're pushing me out, and that's worse." She left without another word, the door clicking shut behind her like the crack of a whip. Andrew collapsed onto the couch, the silence that followed louder than any argument. For the first time since Maya had entered his life, he felt the weight of her absence, and it terrified him more than Thomas ever had. Maya's breaking point. Maya returned to her small room above the Lennox garage that night, her chest heavy with anger and sorrow. She had given so much of herself, time, energy, compassion, only to be met with a wall of pride she couldn't break through. For hours she sat at her desk, staring at the faded photograph of Marcus, her brother, whispering aloud the questions she hadn't dared voice. Am I a fool, Marcus? Am I pouring myself into someone who'll never let me in? Maybe Mrs. Lennox is right. Maybe I'm just meant to serve, to watch everyone else's life fall apart while mine never begins. The tears came then, hot and relentless. Maya rarely cried. She had built her strength on silence, on swallowing pain before it could spill. But that night the dam broke. She wept for Andrew, for Ellie, for her own forgotten dreams, and for the cruel truth that compassion sometimes hurt more than indifference. When dawn finally broke, she rose weary but resolved. She wasn't done, not with Andrew, not with Ellie, not with herself. But something had to change. She couldn't keep giving without boundaries, couldn't keep standing beside someone who refused to see her not as a rescuer but as a partner. A child's plea. 2 days passed in strained silence. Andrew stumbled through the motions, dragging himself to job centers, filling out applications, watching rejection pile upon rejection. Maya buried herself in work, avoiding the apartment, convincing herself distance was necessary. Yet in the quiet space between them, someone else noticed, the one person neither of them wanted to hurt. Ellie climbed into Andrew's lap one evening, her small voice trembling. "Where's Maya, Daddy? Did she leave because of me?" The question shattered him. He hugged her tightly, whispering fiercely, "No, baby, she didn't leave because of you. Never because of you." But the truth clawed at him. If Maya had left, it was because of him, because of his pride, his anger, his inability to let someone love them without seeing it as pity. That night, Andrew sat awake long after Ellie had drifted off, staring at the ceiling. He realized then that the real battle wasn't Thomas or poverty or betrayal. The battle was within him. The battle to accept that strength sometimes meant letting others in. And if he didn't win it soon, he would lose the only people left who mattered. The unexpected blow. As if fate sought to test them further, another blow landed when the Lennox family summoned Maya to their study. Mr. Lennox, polished and cold, delivered the verdict without flinching. "We've decided to replace you, Maya. You've been distracted lately, and we require someone fully committed." He handed her a severance envelope as though discarding an accessory rather than a person. Maya accepted it silently, her pride refusing to let them see her break. She walked out of the mansion with her belongings in 2 bags, her head held high, though inside she felt hollow. She had lost not just income but stability, the fragile thread that had kept her tethered to some semblance of security. That evening, she sat on a park bench with nowhere to go, staring at the severance envelope in her lap. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had stood by Andrew in his storms, and now she was caught in her own. The breaking point when Andrew learned of Maya's dismissal, he rushed to find her, fear overriding pride. He found her in the park, her bags at her feet, her eyes distant. For a long moment he stood watching her, the weight of his own failures pressing down. Then he sat beside her, his voice quiet but earnest. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I pushed you away because I was scared. Scared of being seen as weak, scared of needing someone. But the truth is, I do need you, Maya, not to save me, to stand with me, and I want to stand with you too." Maya turned to him, her eyes wet but fierce. "Then prove it, Andrew. Prove you're not just a man surviving, but a man willing to fight for something bigger than his pride." Their gazes held in the fading light, 2 broken souls meeting at the crossroads of despair and hope. This was their breaking point, not the end, but the moment that would decide whether they rose together or crumbled apart. A week of small wars the following week unfolded like a string of small battles, each demanding more than Andrew thought he had left to give. The warehouse cut his hours, a blow he had seen coming but still felt like a punch to the gut. He stretched what little pay remained across rent, utilities, and groceries, always coming up short no matter how carefully he calculated. Nights became longer, filled with restless pacing while Ellie slept, and mornings bled into exhaustion. Poverty had a way of turning every errand into a battlefield, choosing between bus fare or bread, between laundry or light bills. It gnawed at his pride, but it gnawed more fiercely at his hope. Maya stepped into these battles not with fanfare but with quiet consistency. She appeared with groceries when she knew his cupboards were bare, slipped a pack of crayons into Ellie's hands when the girl grew restless, and offered rides when Andrew's old sedan coughed its last breath in the middle of an intersection. He argued with her at first, snapping that he didn't need saving, but Maya never wavered. She answered his pride with patience, reminding him that survival wasn't about one person shouldering the world. It was about carrying pieces of it together. Slowly, Andrew began to accept that truth, though every acceptance felt like prying loose another piece of his stubborn armor. The real war, however, was not fought in grocery aisles or at the gas pump. It was fought within, the endless tug-of-war between despair and determination. Andrew felt it every time he looked at his daughter's small face, her wide eyes trusting him completely. And Maya felt it every time she clocked out of her employer's mansion, where abundance overflowed, only to return to her small room above the garage and wonder if her own life would ever hold more than servitude. They were different, yet their wars echoed one another in uncanny rhythm. Prejudice in the shadows. It was a Saturday when Maya accompanied Andrew and Ellie to a community center downtown, where a clothing drive promised to ease some of their burdens. The center was bustling with families, volunteers, and stacks of donated goods. Maya guided Ellie through racks of children's clothes, her laughter ringing as she tried on a jacket 2 sizes too big. Andrew, however, stood stiffly near the entrance, his discomfort radiating like heat. Accepting help in such a public way felt like being paraded through a hall of mirrors, each reflection reminding him of how far he had fallen. But the sting of humiliation sharpened when he overheard whispers nearby. A pair of well-dressed women, sorting donations at a table, eyed him with poorly concealed judgment. "Isn't that the Monroe guy? The one who crashed his company, and now he's here, begging for handouts?" One of them snickered. How the mighty have fallen. Andrew's fists clenched at his sides, every instinct screaming to lash out. Before he could, Maya appeared at his side, her voice clear and cutting through the murmurs. "Funny thing about people who laugh at others' downfall," she said, her tone cool but sharp. "They forget life can turn in an instant. Today it's him. Tomorrow it could be you." The women flushed, muttering excuses before retreating into silence. Andrew stared at her, stunned. No one had defended him like that in years. Pride warred with gratitude in his chest. But before he could speak, Maya returned to Ellie, adjusting the oversized jacket with a smile as if nothing had happened. It was then Andrew realized her strength wasn't loud or showy. It was steady, the kind of strength that protected without asking for recognition. And for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder what it might feel like to lean into that strength fully. The cost of compassion, yet compassion came at a cost, and Maya bore it quietly. The Lennox family had begun to notice her fatigue, the way she returned later from errands or slipped away on weekends. Mrs. Lennox, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, hinted one evening that help ought to remember where their priorities lie. Maya bit her tongue, offering a polite smile while swallowing the frustration burning inside. Her employers lived in opulence, their pantry overflowing, their closets bursting with clothes worn once then forgotten, yet they scrutinized her every minute, as though her loyalty should be purchased with their leftovers. After work, Maya returned to Andrew's apartment, carrying a bag of discounted groceries she had bought with her own dwindling wages. Andrew noticed the circles under her eyes, the weariness in her posture, and something inside him shifted. Until now he had seen her as unshakable, a force of nature immune to exhaustion. But in that moment he saw the truth. She was carrying her own battles, sacrificing more than she admitted, all to stand beside him and Ellie. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly, his voice stripped of defensiveness this time. Maya set the groceries down and met his gaze. "Because I know what it feels like to be on the edge and wonder if anyone cares. And because your little girl deserves more than the world is giving her right now. I can't fix everything, Andrew. But I can show up, and sometimes showing up is everything." Her words struck him deeper than any lecture or charity ever had. For the first time, Andrew felt gratitude not as a wound to his pride, but as a balm to his soul. The fire within one evening. As autumn deepened, Andrew and Maya found themselves sitting outside the apartment while Ellie slept inside. The night air was crisp, filled with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Andrew leaned against the railing, staring at the city lights while Maya sat beside him, her arms folded against the chill. "I used to think success meant building something the world couldn't ignore," Andrew admitted, his voice low. "But now I realize success might just mean keeping a roof over her head and food in her belly." Maya turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe success isn't about the world at all. Maybe it's about the small battles, The meals made, the nights endured, the people we refused to give up on. Maybe those victories matter more than headlines ever did. Andrew considered her words, the bitterness in his chest loosening just enough to let hope seep through. For so long he had measured himself by the empire he had lost. But in Maya's eyes, he saw a different kind of measurement, one that valued endurance, compassion, and the fire to keep going even when the world turned its back. That night, for the first time in years, Andrew allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by failure but by resilience. And sitting beside Maya, he began to wonder if perhaps his story wasn't over after all. A child's wisdom, it was Ellie in her innocent way who bound them closer than words ever could. One afternoon, while Maya helped her draw on scrap paper, Ellie looked up with wide eyes and said, "Are you my new mommy?" The question hung in the air, pure and unfiltered, stabbing Andrew's heart with both pain and longing. Maya froze, her throat tightening. She reached out, brushing a curl from Ellie's forehead. "No, sweet girl," she said softly, "but I'm your friend, and I'll always look out for you." Andrew stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion the moment stirred in him. He wanted to correct Ellie, to remind her that she still had a mother somewhere, even if she had chosen absence. But he couldn't bring himself to break the fragile warmth of the moment. Instead, he let it wash over him, realizing that his daughter's innocent heart saw what his prideful mind had refused to acknowledge. Maya wasn't just helping them survive. She was becoming part of their lives in ways he couldn't deny. A fragile alliance. By the end of that week, Andrew and Maya had formed something neither of them fully defined. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was deeper than friendship, stronger than convenience. It was an alliance forged in struggle, tested by poverty and tempered by shared wounds. Together they faced sneers, overdue bills, and sleepless nights. Together they learned that survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about refusing to let the world strip away dignity, compassion, or hope. But in the shadows, Thomas Vexley still lurked, watching with growing contempt. And though Andrew and Maya had found strength in each other, they both sensed that their shared battles were only the beginning. Larger storms loomed on the horizon, storms that would demand more than resilience, they would demand sacrifice. For now, though as Ellie slept peacefully and the city's hum faded into the night, Andrew and Maya allowed themselves one fragile victory, the knowledge that they were no longer fighting alone. A storm on the horizon, the rain had lifted by the following week, leaving the city washed clean yet heavy with the smell of damp asphalt. Andrew had managed to keep the warehouse job for a handful of nights, though every shift left him aching as though his bones themselves resented the labor. Still, he clung to it like a drowning man clings to driftwood. It wasn't just about money. It was about the illusion of stability, the small shred of dignity that came with telling himself he was working to rebuild something. But peace, however fragile, never lingered long. Word traveled quickly in circles Andrew wished he had left behind, and it wasn't long before Thomas Vexley reappeared, not as a passing shadow in the grocery store this time, but as a deliberate presence. The first hint came when Andrew saw his own name dragged back into an online article, From Visionary to Vanished, the Andrew Monroe story. It carried Thomas's fingerprints all over it, written with the kind of subtle cruelty that twisted facts just enough to poison perception. Andrew closed the laptop in disgust, but the damage was already done. That night, neighbors whispered. The warehouse manager looked at him with new suspicion, as though failure were contagious. Pride burned in Andrew's chest, but it was something deeper that frightened him, the realization that Thomas wasn't finished with him yet. For Thomas, humiliation had always been a sport. Andrew knew that too well, and if Maya's defiance at the store had irritated him, then the knowledge that Andrew had found even the faintest glimmer of support in her must have enraged him further. Men like Thomas didn't simply win, they needed others to lose completely. The coffee shop encounter Maya found herself on break at a small corner cafe one afternoon, stealing a rare moment of peace between errands for the Lennox family. She sipped her coffee slowly, staring out the window at the bustle of the street when a shadow fell across her table. Looking up, she felt her stomach tighten. Thomas Vexley stood there, smirk sharp as a blade, his expensive coat slung carelessly over one arm. "Well, if it isn't the maid who thinks she's a savior," he drawled, sliding into the chair opposite her without waiting for permission. His cologne carried the sharpness of wealth, and his presence turned the warm cafe air cold. Maya's jaw clenched. "What do you want?" Thomas leaned back, studying her with mock interest. "I want to understand. You're smart enough to see what kind of man Andrew is. Broken, bitter, barely holding himself together. So why waste your energy? Do you enjoy collecting strays?" Maya's eyes flashed, though her voice remained measured. "I don't collect people. I stand with them. Something you wouldn't understand." He chuckled, the sound dripping with derision. "You think standing with him makes you noble?" "It makes you foolish. He'll drag you down with him. People like him don't rise again. And when he collapses, you'll be right there in the rubble." Maya leaned forward now, her expression steady. "Better rubble with someone worth standing beside than palaces built on betrayal." Her words cut through his smirk, but only for a heartbeat. He masked the flicker of anger quickly, leaning in closer. "You warned him once," Thomas whispered, "and he didn't listen. Don't waste your breath again. When he falls this time, it won't just be his ruin, it'll be yours too." With that, he rose smoothly, dropped a few bills on the table as if to suggest he had paid for her coffee, and left the cafe with the arrogance of a man convinced the world bent to his will. Maya sat frozen, the taste of bitterness stronger than the coffee in her cup. Andrew's breaking point that evening. Andrew returned home to find an envelope slid under his apartment door. Inside was a printed copy of the very article he had tried to ignore, certain phrases underlined in red ink. At the bottom, scrawled in handwriting he recognized instantly, were the words, "Still think you can outlast me?" He crumpled the paper in his fist, fury surging like fire through his veins. Every muscle in his body screamed to fight back, to storm into Thomas's sleek office and finally make him pay. But reality hit harder than anger. He had no lawyers, no resources, no allies. All he had was Ellie asleep in the next room and the gnawing knowledge that his enemy was right. He had already fallen. The rage turned inward quickly, becoming self-loathing. He slammed his fist against the wall, the sound echoing through the small apartment. His knuckles split, blood smearing across the faded paint. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, the weight of everything pressing down. Maya arrived moments later, carrying groceries again, her knock soft but insistent. She found him there, shoulders shaking, blood on his hand. She didn't flinch or ask permission. She simply crossed the room, took his hand gently, and led him to the sink. Her touch was firm but tender as she cleaned the wound. The silence between them filled not with judgment but with quiet understanding. "You can't let him do this to you," she said finally, her voice low but fierce. "He wants you broken." "Don't give him the satisfaction." Andrew's voice cracked. "What if I already am?" Maya met his eyes, unyielding. "Then you rebuild." "That's what we do. That's what survivors do." A shared defiance days later, Andrew walked Ellie to the park, her small hand gripping his as she skipped ahead. Maya joined them, unplanned but welcome, carrying a bag of sandwiches wrapped in foil. They sat together on a worn bench while Ellie played on the swings, her laughter cutting through the heaviness of their conversation. "He's not going to stop," Andrew admitted quietly, watching his daughter. "Thomas, he'll keep circling until there's nothing left of me." Maya handed him a sandwich, her tone steady. "Then you don't fight him alone. He wants you isolated, ashamed, convinced you're finished. Don't give him that power." "You're not finished, Andrew. Not unless you choose to be." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not pity but fire in her gaze. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him. Not the desperate flicker of survival, but the faintest spark of defiance. If Thomas wanted him broken, then maybe the greatest rebellion was simply refusing to shatter completely. Ellie ran back toward them, arms wide, cheeks flushed with joy. Andrew scooped her up, holding her close, and in that simple act he realized that Thomas hadn't taken everything. He still had his daughter. He still had the chance, however small, to build something again. And now he wasn't entirely alone. The lines are drawn, the interference escalated. Anonymous calls began coming at night, silent at first, then punctuated with mocking laughter. Old acquaintances resurfaced, some pretending concern but clearly fishing for gossip. Andrew's new job was suddenly under review, the manager citing concerns that smelled suspiciously of Thomas's influence. The walls were closing in, and Andrew felt it with every passing day. But alongside the fear, something else was taking root. Maya was there, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. She didn't try to erase his pain or deny the reality of what Thomas was doing. She simply refused to let him face it alone. Every meal she dropped off, every word of quiet encouragement, every moment she spent with Ellie, it all built a foundation stronger than the fear Thomas tried to stoke. One night, as they sat together in the apartment after Ellie had gone to bed, Andrew turned to Maya and said the words he had resisted for so long. "I don't know where this ends, but I know I don't want to fight any more battles alone." Maya's smile was faint but unwavering. "Good, because you don't have to." And with that, the lines were drawn. Thomas Vexley could circle like a vulture all he wanted. But Andrew and Maya, two people battered by life, scarred by betrayal and hardship, were no longer standing separately. They had begun, however, tentatively to stand together. The night of ghosts, after Maya left, Andrew sat in the dim light of his apartment long after Ellie had fallen into deeper sleep. The silence of the place was not peaceful. It was suffocating, filled with echoes of what used to be. He stared at the formula can on the counter, the very thing that had ignited an argument with a stranger hours earlier, and he hated himself for resenting it. A part of him wanted to toss it in the trash, to rid himself of the humiliation tied to it, but then he thought of Ellie, and shame melted into a dull ache that sat heavy in his chest. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. When he did drift off, it was rarely restful. Tonight, as on so many others, memories clawed their way to the surface like ghosts refusing to stay buried. He remembered the sharp glow of boardroom lights, the confidence in his own voice as he pitched ideas that once seemed unstoppable. He remembered headlines, "Tech visionary Andrew Monroe disrupts the market," and the wild adrenaline of being called a genius. He also remembered the first crack in that illusion, a contract he had signed without reading every clause, because Thomas Vexley had assured him it was standard procedure. That night returned to him vividly now, the moment he realized his best friend had outmaneuvered him. When lawyers showed him the fine print and his equity, his authority, his vision, all of it was gone. The shame of sitting in a courtroom while Thomas painted him as reckless, a liability. The reporters who once begged for quotes now feasted on his downfall, splashing his mistakes across headlines like blood in the water. But what cut deeper than betrayal or bankruptcy was the night his wife stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, her eyes colder than he had ever seen them. "I can't do this anymore," she'd said. "I didn't marry a failure." He'd begged her to stay, not for himself, but for Ellie, who was barely 2 then. But she walked out anyway, her footsteps echoing down the hall like nails sealing a coffin. That sound never left him. Andrew rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands as if he could push the memories away. But they clung stubbornly, reminders that he had once touched greatness and now couldn't afford baby formula. Pride had become his last defense, the only thing shielding him from the humiliation of being pitied. Yet tonight, as he stared at the shadows on the wall, he wondered if perhaps pride was no longer armor at all. Perhaps it was just a chain dragging him deeper into despair. Behind Maya's walls across town, Maya arrived at the Lennox estate, a grand house that glowed like a palace in the night. She parked her modest hatchback at the edge of the servants' lot, slipped quietly inside through the back entrance, and climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the garage where she lived. The contrast was staggering. The house beneath her gleamed with chandeliers, polished marble, and furniture imported from Europe, while her space was barely larger than a walk-in closet. A narrow bed, a single dresser, and a desk where stacks of unpaid bills sat waiting. Maya kicked off her shoes and sat heavily on the mattress, exhaling a long, tired breath. To the Lennox family, she was simply the help, someone who kept their world spotless and their schedules running smoothly. They rarely asked about her life, and she rarely offered. What would she even say? That she had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, but her mother's illness and the mountain of debt it left behind had forced her into endless work? That she had buried her own ambitions under the weight of survival? She pulled open her desk drawer and took out a faded photograph of her younger brother, Marcus. He had been barely 18 when he was arrested, another casualty of a system quick to punish and slow to forgive. For years she had sent letters, scraped together bail money, and stood in courtrooms that smelled of stale sweat and hopelessness. He was out now, trying to piece his life together. But she still felt responsible, as if her failure to protect him had carved a scar into her very soul. Maya pressed the photo against her chest and closed her eyes. She had built her strength from necessity, But strength came with its own kind of loneliness. People admired resilience from a distance, but few wanted to stand in the trenches with you. Perhaps that was why she had spoken up in the store, why she couldn't walk past Andrew's struggle. She recognized the hollow look in his eyes because it was the same one she saw in her own mirror some days. The morning reckoning. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, rain clouds stretching low over the city. Andrew dressed Ellie in a thrift store jacket patched at the elbows and prepared to face another day of uncertainty. He had an interview lined up, though calling it that was generous. A friend of a friend had mentioned a warehouse looking for night shift workers. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't lucrative, but it was something. He packed Ellie's small backpack with crayons and a worn coloring book, preparing to leave her with a neighbor for a few hours. When he opened the door, he nearly stumbled at the sight of Maya standing there, holding a thermos in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. "Thought you might need breakfast on the go," she said simply, offering no explanation for how she had known where he lived or why she had come so early. He blinked at her, torn between irritation and a strange sense of relief. "You didn't have to." "I know," she interrupted, pressing the bag into his hand before he could finish. "But you don't always get what you deserve in life. Sometimes you get what someone else is willing to give." Inside the bag was nothing fancy. 2 boiled eggs, a piece of cornbread wrapped in foil, and an apple. But Andrew's throat tightened anyway. He wanted to argue, to tell her he could handle himself, but the truth was he couldn't remember the last time someone had handed him anything without expecting something in return. For a moment he stood frozen, the weight of the small meal heavier than any debt he'd ever carried. Ellie peeked from behind his legs, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the apple. Maya crouched down, offering a smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, Ellie." The little girl smiled shyly, clutching her coloring book to her chest. Andrew cleared his throat, his voice rough. I'll take it. Thank you." The words tasted strange on his tongue, as though unused for too long, but they carried a sincerity Maya didn't miss. Shared scars. Later that afternoon, as rain drummed steadily against the warehouse roof, Andrew found himself pushing boxes heavier than his pride. His muscles ached, his hands blistered, but there was a strange relief in the mindless labor. Work was simple, it demanded sweat, not explanations. Yet even there he thought of Maya. He thought of the way she had looked at him, not with pity but with recognition, as if she saw something of herself in him. That evening, when he came to pick Ellie up from the neighbors, he found Maya sitting cross-legged on the floor with her, crayons scattered around them. They were coloring clumsy rainbows across cheap printer paper, and Ellie's laughter filled the room like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Andrew stood in the doorway for a moment, his chest tightening. He hadn't heard his daughter laugh like that in weeks. When Maya noticed him, she didn't jump up or try to explain herself. She simply smiled and handed Ellie another crayon. "She's got a good imagination," she said softly. Andrew stepped inside, setting down his jacket. "She gets that from her mom." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and his chest ached with the memory. Maya glanced at him, her eyes gentle, not prying. "Loss leaves holes in us," she said. "But sometimes those holes let the light through." The words hit him with unexpected force. He sank into a chair, exhausted, and for the first time in years he began to speak. Not in headlines, not in sound bites, but in raw fragments of truth. He told her about the betrayal, the courtroom, the night his wife left. Maya listened, her silence steady and unflinching. And when he finally asked about her, she didn't hide. She spoke of Marcus, of endless work, of the loneliness of being strong because you had no other choice. For a long while, the two of them sat in that small apartment, sharing scars like war stories, not for sympathy but for understanding. And in that exchange, something fragile but powerful began to grow. The awareness that perhaps neither of them was as alone as they had believed. The long walk to nowhere. As the last of the daylight faded, Andrew lingered by the car longer than necessary, his hands resting on the roof as though he needed its rusted frame to hold him steady. The parking lot had thinned, leaving only a handful of vehicles scattered like tired relics of the day. Maya watched him carefully, sensing the invisible weight he carried but also recognizing the stubbornness etched deep into his posture. Men like him, she thought, often clung so tightly to their pride that they failed to see it was dragging them down. She had seen it before, in relatives, in neighbors, in the faces of people who insisted they were fine when anyone with eyes could tell they weren't. Andrew finally straightened, exhaling as if dragging the air out of his very bones. "You should probably go," he muttered, not quite looking at her. "You've done your good deed for the day." The words were meant to dismiss her, but they sounded hollow, almost like he was trying to convince himself rather than her. Maya's response came without hesitation. "I'm not here for a good deed, Andrew. I didn't follow you out here because I wanted to pat myself on the back. I did it because I couldn't walk away. Not from you, not from her." She tilted her chin toward Ellie, sleeping soundly in the stroller. "That little girl deserves someone in her corner, and if you're too proud to see that right now, then fine. But I see her, and I won't pretend I don't." The words settled between them like stones, heavy and undeniable. Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tight. For a moment he wanted to lash out, to push her away with anger, because anger was easier than admitting she was right. But his voice betrayed him when he finally spoke, softer than he intended. "You don't know what you're signing up for." Maya crossed her arms. "Life's never asked me what I signed up for. I just show up anyway." It was then that Andrew realized this woman wasn't like the people who had abandoned him when his world crumbled. She wasn't standing there for his approval, nor was she angling for gratitude. She was simply present, steady as the ground beneath his feet, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Shadows of home. The drive back to Andrew's apartment was short, but Maya followed behind in her modest decade-old hatchback, something tugging at her not to let the evening end at the grocery store parking lot. He hadn't asked her to, hadn't even looked her way as he pulled out, but her instincts guided her like an inner compass. By the time they reached the worn-down complex on the east side of town, where bricks bore cracks and balconies sagged under years of neglect, Maya understood why his pride had fought so fiercely in the store. The building was not just tired, it was defeated. Flickering hallway lights buzzed with indifference, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the stairwell walls. Andrew carried Ellie up the narrow steps, careful not to jostle her awake, while Maya trailed a step behind, carrying the groceries without asking. He unlocked the door to a unit whose paint had long since dulled to a lifeless beige. The inside was sparse. An old couch with a tear in the fabric, a coffee table scarred with scratches, and shelves bare except for a few children's books stacked neatly in the corner. Ellie stirred as he laid her gently on a makeshift bed fashioned from a futon mattress in the living room. She blinked sleepily, rubbed her eyes, and murmured something inaudible before drifting back into slumber. Andrew lingered over her, brushing a stray curl from her forehead with a tenderness that contradicted the hardness he carried outside. Maya stood quietly in the doorway, her heart aching at the sight. When he finally turned back to her, there was no pretense left. "This is what it is," he said plainly, gesturing around the small room. "This is what's left of me." Maya set the grocery bag on the counter and met his gaze. "It's not what's left of you. It's where you're starting from." Her words were firm, deliberate, spoken like a truth she wanted to carve into the walls themselves. Andrew's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to believe her, but the echo of his past haunted every corner of the room. The framed newspaper clipping that once celebrated his company's launch now sat face down on the shelf. The degrees and accolades that used to hang proudly on his office wall were nowhere to be seen. To him, this apartment wasn't a beginning, it was a monument to failure. Yet somehow, in the warmth of Maya's gaze, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. The possibility of being seen, not for what he had lost, but for what he might still become. The first crack in the wall. They sat at the kitchen table later, the dim overhead bulb casting long shadows on the peeling linoleum. Andrew poured 2 glasses of tap water, the best he could offer, while Maya unpacked the groceries in silence. She pulled the formula can from her tote and set it firmly on the counter. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw. "You don't know what it does to a man, to look at something his child needs and realize he can't provide it. To hold it in his hand and put it back because the money won't stretch far enough. It eats at you. Makes you wonder if maybe everyone else was right, that you were never as strong or as smart as you thought." He paused, fingers tightening around the glass. "That maybe you're nothing." Maya leaned forward, her eyes sharp but compassionate. "You're wrong. You're not nothing, Andrew. You're a father who's still here, still trying, even when it cost you everything. That little girl sleeping in the next room, she doesn't see failure when she looks at you. She sees the only person who hasn't walked away. Her words cracked something inside him. For months he had carried his pain like a fortress, shutting out every attempt at kindness. But here was this woman, a stranger in uniform, sitting in his kitchen and dismantling his defenses without effort. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he let his shoulders drop, the tension easing just enough for vulnerability to slip through. "Why are you doing this?" he whispered. "Why do you care?" Maya's gaze didn't waver. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. And I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever saw someone standing on the edge, I wouldn't just walk past. Maybe I can't fix everything for you, Andrew, but I can stand here. Sometimes that's enough." The silence that followed was not heavy this time. It was fragile, almost sacred, like the moment before dawn when the world holds its breath. In that silence, something shifted between them. Not friendship, not trust, not yet, but the fragile beginnings of both. Pride and the weight of silence. The automatic doors of the store slid open and closed, letting in a draft of cool autumn air and the chatter of people moving about their weekend errands. But inside Andrew Monroe's world, silence pressed down like a suffocating blanket. His hand still hovered where he had steadied Maya moments before, though he quickly withdrew it as if any gesture of vulnerability might betray too much. Pride had been his armor for years, though battered and dented, and in moments like this it became more curse than shield. He could feel the burn of eyes from the nearby shoppers, all of them pretending not to listen but secretly absorbing every fragment of the scene. Once Andrew had been the man people pointed at in admiration. Now he was the man they whispered about. The man who once had it all and had watched it crumble. Maya, on the other hand, stood her ground with the kind of quiet ferocity that came from surviving storms of her own. She wasn't a stranger to being judged in public spaces, wasn't unfamiliar with the sting of humiliation in front of strangers. But what unsettled her now wasn't the shove from Thomas or the curious stares. It was the man beside her, too stubborn to accept the help he desperately needed, too consumed by the shadow of his former life to see that hunger did not negotiate with pride. For Maya, that little girl in the stroller wasn't just another child. She was a mirror of all the times Maya had gone to bed with an empty stomach in her own childhood, clutching something small and meaningless to pretend it was enough. Andrew cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice low but jagged. "You don't understand. I've made enough mistakes to choke on, and the last thing I need is someone else swooping in like I'm some charity case. My daughter will eat. Maybe not that formula, maybe not tonight, but I'll make sure she does." The words carried a rehearsed sharpness, as though he had been repeating variations of them to himself for months, to landlords, to bill collectors, to people offering pity disguised as kindness. But beneath the barbed edges, Maya heard what he hadn't meant to reveal, the raw desperation of a father clinging to dignity, even as it slipped through his fingers. Her gaze softened, though her tone remained steady. "Maybe you think I don't understand, but I know more than you imagine. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to have people look right past you when you're drowning. And I know what it feels like to beg heaven for a miracle and have it come in the form of something you'd rather refuse. This isn't about you, Andrew. It's about her." She nodded toward Ellie, who by now had dozed off, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm, still clutching the empty juice box as though she dared not let go of the last symbol of comfort she had. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken histories. Two lives that had traveled through different worlds only to intersect in this fluorescent-lit battlefield of pride and compassion. For a moment, Andrew wanted to lash back, to tell her she had no right, but the sight of his daughter's tiny fingers clutching plastic stopped him. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand across his face as if to erase the weariness etched there, but of course it remained. Echoes of the past. When they finally stepped out of the store, the autumn sun was already dipping toward the horizon, staining the sky with streaks of amber and rose. The parking lot was half empty, carts clattering in the distance as attendants rounded them up. Andrew walked stiffly beside the stroller, the bag with bread and milk dangling from one hand, while Maya kept pace a step behind, the formula can still nestled in her tote. She hadn't pressed him further, hadn't tried to hand it to him again, but the weight of it felt heavier than groceries. It was a question, a challenge, a promise, all stuffed into a simple paper bag. Andrew stopped near an old sedan that had clearly seen better days. Rust crawled along the edges and one of the side mirrors was held together with duct tape. He unlocked it with a sigh and began to load the groceries inside, careful not to wake Ellie. Maya watched silently, her mind drifting back to the days when her own mother had juggled bags into a car, just as beaten down, making sacrifices Maya had been too young to appreciate at the time. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat and finally spoke. "Thomas," she said, her voice quieter now. "He's the reason you're like this, isn't he?" Andrew froze, his back stiffening at the name. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he leaned against the car door, eyes narrowed on some invisible horizon, the bitterness in his voice thick. "Thomas Vexley was once my partner, my friend, or at least I thought so. We built everything together. Late nights, risks, sleepless weeks chasing an idea that felt bigger than life itself. Then when the first real investors came knocking, he made sure the papers slid his way. Buried clauses, signatures I trusted, promises I was too arrogant to double-check. By the time I realized the company was his and I was a ghost of my own creation." Maya folded her arms, her jaw tight. Betrayal wasn't foreign to her either, though hers had come in smaller, more personal doses. Family who borrowed money and never repaid it, employers who shaved hours off her paycheck, friends who disappeared when her life became too heavy. She felt a strange kinship with Andrew's pain, even though his fall had been from a far greater height. "And you never fought back?" she asked. "I tried," Andrew admitted, his voice thick with weariness. "But by then I was already painted as unstable, reckless. The media loved the story of the genius who imploded. Investors sided with the man in the suit who looked like control, not the man who was drowning. I lost everything. My wife, Ellie's mother, left not long after. She said she didn't sign up for poverty. So here we are." His hand brushed over the stroller gently, almost apologetically, as though he owed his daughter an explanation for the life she'd been born into. Maya's chest tightened. She thought of all the times she had wanted to walk away from her own struggles, to shed the weight of responsibility and vanish. But she never had. Responsibility in her world wasn't something you could abandon. It clung to you, demanded of you even when you had nothing left to give. She stepped closer, her voice steady. "You're still standing, Andrew. That counts for more than you think." He looked at her then, really looked at her as though for the first time seeing past the uniform she wore, past the assumptions he might have made. In her eyes he saw no judgment, no pity, only a strength that unsettled him. For a moment he wondered if perhaps this stranger saw him more clearly than he had allowed anyone to in years. Seeds of a reluctant bond. The wind picked up, scattering dry leaves across the asphalt, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Andrew busied himself checking Ellie's blanket, tucking it around her small body while Maya simply stood nearby, unwilling to leave but unsure what more to say. There was a strange pull between them, something neither of them had expected when this day began. Two very different lives colliding in the most ordinary of places, bound together not by choice but by circumstance. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "I'm not here to save you." "Don't think that. But sometimes people are put in front of us for a reason. Maybe today that reason was to remind you that you don't have to fight every battle alone." Her words lingered in the air, simple yet weighty like stones dropped into a still pond. Andrew wanted to scoff, to reject the notion, but he couldn't. The truth was, the loneliness had been eating at him for months, perhaps years, nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if his daughter would grow up resenting him, wondering if he could claw his way back from the wreckage of mistakes and betrayals. Pride had kept him moving, but pride didn't fill empty stomachs or pay overdue bills. For the first time in a long while, he considered the possibility that letting someone in, even a stranger, might not be the worst thing. Still, old habits died hard. He managed a faint smile, weary but genuine. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Maya's lips curved into the smallest of smirks. "Takes one to know one." The moment was fragile, unspoken, but real. Neither of them could yet name what it meant, but both felt the shift. Something had begun in aisle 9, something more than an argument over baby formula. It was the spark of a story neither of them had been searching for, yet both desperately needed. The aisle of choices. The fluorescent lights of Green Mart buzzed faintly overhead, casting an artificial glow over rows of cereal boxes, canned soups, and baby supplies. For Maya Williams, Saturday afternoons in this store were normally uneventful. She'd shop for her employer, the Lennox family, cross items off their carefully written lists and hurry back before her shift ended. But today, something tugged at her attention. Something, or rather someone, who didn't belong among the coupons and weekly specials. She spotted him in aisle 9, standing motionless in front of a shelf lined with baby formula. Andrew Monroe. Even if she hadn't recognized his weary face from news articles years ago, the way he carried himself, like a man who used to command rooms but now struggled to lift even his own spirit, was unmistakable. Once a celebrated tech entrepreneur, his name used to appear in magazines, praised as the innovator who would change the future. Yet here he was, staring at a single price tag as though it mocked him. $24.99. Maya noticed his jaw clench. His hand reached for the can of formula, fingers curling around it with hesitation before he slowly placed it back on the shelf. His little girl, maybe 4 years old, sat quietly in a stroller a few feet away, hugging an empty juice box like it was a prized possession. No complaints, no whining. Just silence, the kind that comes from learning too early that sometimes asking makes things worse. Maya's chest tightened. She pretended to browse canned soup from the end cap, though her eyes refused to leave the scene. She had worked as a maid long enough to recognize quiet desperation, the kind you try to mask with pride. Andrew picked the can up again. He studied it, his lips moving faintly, perhaps calculating. Then, with a sigh that seemed to drain the life from him, he put it back once more. This time his hand lingered on the shelf as though letting go was the hardest part. Something stirred inside Maya. She wasn't one to meddle, but hunger was no place for pride. She glanced around, no one else had noticed. Without thinking twice, she circled to the next aisle, grabbed the same can from a lower shelf, and walked briskly to self-checkout. The scanner beeped. She slid her debit card and prayed the balance would cover it. It did. Relief rushed over her. She stuffed the can into her tote, heart beating faster as though she'd committed some daring act of rebellion. The offer rejected Andrew stood at the register with a loaf of bread and a gallon of milk. His total was barely over $6. Maya approached quietly, clutching her tote. When the cashier handed him his receipt, she stepped forward and held out the bag. "Here," she said gently. He blinked. "What's this?" "You put it back," Maya explained, keeping her voice soft but firm. "I figured the little one shouldn't go to bed hungry." He froze, eyes flicking from her to the bag, then to his daughter. Something in his expression hardened. "I didn't ask for your help," he said flatly. Maya tilted her chin. "You didn't have to." He pushed the bag back toward her, his pride sharp as broken glass. "I don't want your pity." "This ain't pity," Maya snapped louder than she intended. Her words cracked through the checkout line like a whip. "It's a child needing to eat." Ellie's wide eyes lifted from the stroller, silently watching the adult spar over her invisible hunger. Andrew's shoulders tensed. His silence carried the weight of years of struggle, shame, and unspoken battles. A ghost from the past before either of them could say another word. A voice sliced through the tension. Well, if it isn't the fallen king and the maid who warned him. Maya's stomach dropped. She turned to see Thomas Vexley standing by the bakery section, a croissant in hand and arrogance dripping from his every word. His tailored blazer looked out of place in the modest grocery store. His smirk, however, fit perfectly, the smirk of a man who thrived on another's downfall. "Didn't think I'd run into you two here," Thomas continued, savoring every syllable. "I guess Whole Foods was too high-end for you now, Andy?" Andrew's fists clenched, but he said nothing. Thomas's gaze flicked to Maya. "Still playing the savior, huh? Some things never change." Maya's chest burned. She took a step forward. "You think this is funny? You wrecked that man's life and now you walk around here like nothing happened." Thomas laughed, cruel and dismissive. "I didn't wreck anything. He handed it to me. I simply took the opportunity." The smirk never left his face as he leaned closer, his words loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "You know what the saddest part is, Maya? You warned him, and he still chose me over you." With that, Thomas gave a mock salute, shoved past Maya hard enough to jostle her into the cart, and strode toward the exit. A can of soup clattered to the floor. Gasps rippled through the checkout line. Andrew reached forward instinctively, steadying Maya by her arm. "Are you okay?" She straightened her coat, brushing away the sting of humiliation. "I'm fine," she muttered. Then, louder, steady as steel. "But I'm not walking away from you like he did." Andrew's brow furrowed. "Why are you even doing this?" "You know why?" Maya replied. her voice carrying a weight even she didn't fully understand.